Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Birding 102, Letting Your New Skills Take Flight, presented by Mike Hillman. Mike has a special interest in birding, sparked by his ornithology professor in college. He's been birding all over North America and took first place in the division in the Great Texas Birding Classic. Is that right, Mike? Mike has been guiding for NatHab in North America and Greenland since 2018, and I'm going to hand things off to him. Take it away, Mike.
Great. Thanks, Kendall. Welcome everyone to our Birding 102 webinar, Letting Your New Skills Take Flight. And I will say that get this going here, the pun is fully intended. So we're gonna go ahead and talk a little bit more in depth about birding as we go along. As Kendall said, I've been guiding for a few years now all over North America. Of course, I've been birding a lot longer than that and leading birding trips in various places throughout North America. So I've got a good background when it comes to talking about identifying birds and the bird watching community in general. I gotta say this picture right here is probably the coolest I've ever looked while birding. My girlfriend took this picture in Montana this year. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some different aspects of birding and taking your skills a little bit higher than maybe they're at right now. To start with, though, if you haven't checked out any other daily dose of nature webinars that NatHab has been doing, they're on YouTube. So you can actually type in Natural Habitat Adventures, go to our YouTube page, and then find all these different webinars. And I want to point out two in particular. The first one, of course, is my Birding 101 webinar that I did back in June. This goes into the basics of birding and really starting with the idea of how to identify birds and starting to think about, okay, what do I notice on the bird? Where does it live? What time of year is it? What am I hearing? Those sorts of things will get you that first little bit about birding. And this is kind of, this webinar is built as kind of an addition to take your skills a little bit higher. Now, something that I won't talk about too much on this is binoculars. That's oftentimes a question that we get with birders is what kind of binoculars should I buy? What works for birding? Those sorts of things. And another webinar I want to point out that happened just last week with one of our guides, Court, and then Ben Lisdis. He's a representative of Swarovski Optic. They spent a whole hour talking about binoculars in their Binoculars 101 presentation. So that can also be found on our YouTube page. So be sure to check out that one, and that'll answer a lot of the questions about what binoculars to use, what kind of features to look for, those sorts of things when it comes to birding. So I won't spend too much talking about that. So to start with this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about where we're going to be talking about birds. So I'm in North America. I'm actually calling in from Michigan right now. And of course, I'm a North American guide. And as we start getting more and more specific as we talk about birding, we have to start narrowing our search when it comes to the locations we're talking about. So whereas with my first presentation, I was very broad, talking about skills and tips and tricks that could be used anywhere in the world when it comes to bird watching. This one, I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on North American species, but still common species, whether you're on the eastern side of North America or the western side of North America. And certainly, though, when it comes to some of the stuff I'll be talking about, those tips and tricks still can be used if you're calling in for Europe or Asia or wherever you may be. But I'll be definitely referring to some species that can be only found in Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So keep that in mind as we're going along. Now, the three main topics I'm going to be talking about is we're going to start off with some of the more hard to identify bird groups. So I'm going to go give you some tips on how to enter identifying them. So we're going to be talking about things like hawks or shorebirds, warblers, and I'm not going to go into too much specifics about individual species, but you, depending on where you are living, can utilize some of the tips that I'm going to be talking about to start your study process and start you being able to tackle these a little more difficult to identify groups. Then from there, we're going to be talking about birding by ear. So being able to listen to those calls and those songs and start to identify birds based off of that. And I'm going to give you a lot of tips and tricks in order to handle when you hear a bird song, what to listen for. But on top of that, the beauty of this day and age in birding is that we have a lot of resources at our disposal, particularly when it comes to learning bird songs, to learning calls and being able to identify them. And so I'm going to spend some time looking at those resources as well, because of course, depending on where you're calling in from, the bird songs will be different. And finally, we're going to be talking about how to be a good birder. And this isn't like how to best identify birds or things like that. It's going to be more on the ethics side of it, what it means to be a good birder, what it means to be a good steward of the landscape that you're in, of the birds you're watching. Those sorts of things that we're going to be focusing there at the end of the presentation. And of course, we'll leave some time for questions at the end. All right, how to start with hard bird groups. To really start tackling some of these more difficult groups that you see out in the field, you start seeing in your field guide, and you're like, all these birds look very similar to each other. How do I be able to identify them apart from each other? I'm going to give you some tips just to start being able to tackle them. The first one, something that I referred to at my last webinar, was this app that you can get for your phone. It's completely free. It's put on by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and it's called Merlin. You can get it for your iPhone, your Android. You can even get it for and this is a really powerful app because it allows you to actually upload a picture that you got of a bird, and it should be able to identify it, which is pretty incredible in its own right. But I use this app specifically. You can go not the Start Bird ID, but if you go down to Explore Birds, you click on that, and what it allows you to do is refine your search. So being able to narrow down what would be a list of hundreds of birds for North America, you can narrow it down to your specific location. In this case, you can narrow it down to your city. So I'm in Royal Oak, Michigan right now, and so I can filter my location down to the city that I'm in, and I can sort and look at the different species that I would more than likely see in the area. And it'll sort it by how likely you are to see them. So in the case of one of the hard groups I'm going to be talking about, the shorebirds, in Royal Oak, Michigan, if you look at the right there, you can see that this bird right here, the killdeer, is going to be my most common bird. You can see this little bar chart here of January through December. I'm here in August right now, and you can see that it's a pretty common bird throughout the entire year based on the width of those little gray bars. Now, if you move down a little bit lower, the spotted sandpiper, you can see this kind of yellow half filled in circle means an uncommon bird, and the red means super rare. And based on sorting those, I really only have 2 shorebirds I need to study. That's the killdeer and that's the spotted sandpiper. The rest are pretty rare, and it's unlikely that I would see them. And so that narrowing that search down is super important because you don't need to be able to study every single hawk, every single warbler you could see in the entirety of North America or wherever you are. Just start studying the ones that you would expect to see in your area, and then you can start noticing those different ones. Like, hey, that's not the usual 4 or 5 species I see here. That's something different. Maybe I'm going to take some notes down. So speaking of noticing something different, this is where a camera comes in pretty handy. Now, if you've got your pair of binoculars and then you add on a camera, it can be a lot to carry out in the field. And so I recommend one of these little point and shoots. They've got a great zoom, and you can zoom in, take a picture of that bird, and be able to identify it later very calmly and quickly back at home. Because when I was starting off in birding, what I would do is I would bring a full field guide, like one of these paper ones right here. I'd bring my binoculars, I'd go out in the field, and I'd see a bird I couldn't identify. I'm like, huh, that's something different. I haven't seen that before. So I'd look at it, then put my binoculars down and start flipping through my book, trying to figure out which bird it was. And then I see some examples and like, okay, this one's supposed to have 2 wing bars. This one's only supposed to have 1. And then I'd look back up at the bird and it would be gone. And that would happen quite a bit. And that's when I started bringing a camera out, is because I'm not as familiar with all the species I could see. But what I could do is take a picture with my camera and then pull on my computer when I get home and notice those subtle little details that I otherwise would not have noticed. By looking at the picture, I can zoom in, I can see different parts of the bird that I wasn't looking at with my binoculars. And so the camera is pretty helpful, especially if you're newer to birding. And it's still even helpful if you're pretty experienced in birding, because you could start to see some of those rare birds, those little red check mark birds that I saw in the Merlin app. You can start seeing some of those rare stuff, and it's good to have a picture to be able to not only share it with the other birding friends, but also to prove your identification if you were to show it or upload it to a site like eBird. So camera is pretty helpful to have, and something like your smartphone to use as a camera almost never works unless you're putting it up to your binoculars, your scope, or something to give a good zoom. So keep that in mind. You might want to bring a little point and shoot with you, and that helps you as you're learning and building your identification. Now, another key thing to do is note taking. Now, this may be something like this gentleman right here, where he's actually got a journal out and he's noting what he's seeing on a particular bird, so he can now go back to his house and use those notes, look through the information on the field guide and see which one matches up. But I also do it, even just verbally helps me a lot to remember it. So my friends and family can attest to this. I'll take my binoculars out and I'll be looking at a bird and I'll notice, hey, that's not a bird I know right off the bat. And so what I'll do is, just while I'm looking, I'll just start saying out loud what I'm seeing. And so that bird has got 2 wing bars, it's got yellow on its back, it's got a longish beak that comes to a point. It's moving around in the trees, going up the side of the tree. And by saying that stuff out loud, I'm kind of memorizing it as I'm going along. So then once that bird has flown away, I can now sit down, look through the field guide using those notes that I've made mentally to figure out what species I'm happen to be looking at. So be thinking about taking notes, either physically with a notepad or just verbally, or if you need to be a little bit quiet, and that'll help you that much more to be able to identify the bird. And so make sure to keep an eye out for every little detail you can as you're looking at that bird, and then go to your field guide, then go to your app, something like that, to be able to identify the bird. So from there, we're gonna just pick 4 basic bird groups that are a little bit more difficult for people to start off with, and just give you those initial tips to be able to break into that group and start to understand your identification. And hopefully then from there, depending on where you are, you'll get to be a bit more of an expert on some of these species you happen to see. So we're gonna start off by talking about raptors, birds of prey like hawks and eagles, and then get into warblers and shorebirds and sparrows as well. So to start off with raptors, birds of prey. This is a fairly big group of birds. It encompasses things like our falcon, like our peregrine falcon up here, things like our kites, like the Mississippi kite, our general hawks, like this red-shouldered hawk, of course, osprey, eagles, harriers, kestrels, those sorts of things are the kinds of birds when I refer to raptors or birds of prey. Now, with any of these groups of birds, the best way to learn them is to practice with them, and that means seeing them out in the field. And so as I talk about each of these groups, I'm going to talk about when and where the best places are to look at them and get some experience. Now with birds of prey, they're fairly large birds, right? And so it takes a bit of effort for them to get in the air. And so oftentimes you don't want to go out first thing in the morning when you're looking for a hawk or an eagle. You usually want to go out a little bit later in the morning. And the reason for that is because of what's called thermals. So as you go out a little bit later in the morning, say 8 or 9, 10 o'clock in the morning, depending on when your sun is risen by you, that ground has enough time to heat up as the sun starts beating down on it. That air around the ground starts to warm up and starts to rise. And that rising column of air helps to lift big birds like our birds of prey, like in this case, the 2 eagles we see right here. And so flying along through the air is quite difficult for them. So any little bit of effort from that uprising wind, those thermals, is pretty important. So a little bit towards mid-morning is a good time to look for these birds of prey flying around. Of course, oftentimes the way you see birds of prey is up in the sky like this. It can be somewhat difficult to see them. They'll be a little bit silhouetted and maybe a little bit farther away. And so we're going to talk about how that you can identify one of our birds of prey even from that distance, from that height up, in just a little bit. But one thing I always say when I talk to people about how to identify raptors is to ask yourself one question first. And that question is, why isn't it a red-tailed hawk? The reason for that is if we look at this map right here, this is the range of the red-tailed hawk. Of course, the red-tailed hawk here on the left. And it is found pretty much throughout all of North America. And so I would hazard a guess that depending on where you are, of course, but about 80 to 90% of the hawks you're going to see are red-tailed hawks. That's your default. And you can use the same tip with your other different hard groups, is figure out using that Merlin app or eBird or some other field guide what your most common bird in your area is for that group, and then use that as your default. It's that unless I see some other weird features. And so we're going to go through the features of red-tailed hawk to get you to understand what to look for. And if one of those key characteristics is broken, then maybe it's something new. And that's when you start taking note of those different field characteristics you happen to see. So with a red-tailed hawk, they're fairly standard hawk. Of course, they are known for that brick red tail. You can see here on this individual soaring along through the air. But that tail isn't always easy to see, and certainly for a juvenile, which is a young bird, usually less than a year to about a year old, they haven't grown those brick red tail feathers in. So I show this picture right here, and you'll notice this is a red-tailed hawk, but its tail is actually brown with some dark brown stripes. So you can't use the red tail as the only key characteristic, but you can use some other characteristics. One thing you'll see on red-tailed hawks is these red arrows on the top right here point to this kind of whitish shoulders that they have. This is actually a red-tailed hawk looking backwards over his shoulder, so we're seeing the back of his body. And these brown and white speckled spots on either side of the shoulders is another characteristic you will see with red-tailed hawks. Now, something else that you'll see is they typically have a white throat and kind of a creamy white belly. Now, there's individual variation, and I'll show that here in just a minute, because red-tailed hawks are found throughout North America. The eastern hawks, the western hawks can look a little bit different, so keep that in mind depending on where you are. And a good field guide will be able to show you the differences, so be sure to study that. Now, another characteristic you'll see is that they oftentimes will have this belly band. So if you see where my arrow is pointed right now, this kind of dark brown spotted area along their belly is something that you'll see. Now you'll notice this individual has a few more stripes along its creamy belly and chest that I was pointing out in the last one. So this is individual variation. But looking for that belly stripe, looking for that brick red tail if it's an adult, looking for those little shoulder patches are pretty important. Now, if you're looking at this bird and it's soaring through the sky, it can be somewhat difficult to be able to see some of that stuff, though in this case, this is a fairly well-lit individual. You can see the belly band. You can see the brick red tail, although it looks a little bit lighter here because it's backlit. But another feature you'll see on a red-tailed hawk are essentially this kind of upper arm section, dark area of feathers, a dark brown section, the same color as the head. And so if you see that on a hawk in North America, you can almost guarantee that's a red-tailed hawk. So use those characteristics to be able to really easily and quickly identify red-tailed hawks. And if you're looking at that hawk and it doesn't meet all those criteria, then this might be something different. I need to pay a little bit closer attention to what I'm looking at here, make some mental notes, and be able to identify this other hawk that I happen to be looking at. Now, when they're in the air, like that red-tailed hawk was in the air, you also want to keep an eye on the silhouette, because depending on if that hawk is really high, if it's backlit, the sun's behind it, you may not see all these subtle characteristics in the coloration that I was just talking about. You may only see the shape of this bird, and you can still use the shape of the bird in flight to be able to identify it. Now, take some of our more obvious birds like our eagles, things. I think of eagles as having like this bald eagle right here. They look kind of like, from wing to wing, they look like a snowboard with a head on one side of that snowboard and a tail on the other side of the snowboard. A very rounded, flat wing shape as it flies. And so you can keep an eye out for something like that. But you'll oftentimes notice the fingers, which if you see where my arrow is pointing right here, just below the word eagles, you'll see little feathers sticking out that you can count individually. Those are the primary feathers. And depending on the bird and how it flies, those feathers actually help with their maneuverability. And so you may see those on some species, those little fingers, like you oftentimes will see them on vultures, like our turkey vulture here. Now, conversely, if we go to a smaller group like the falcons, almost never do you see those individual feathers on the primaries, the very wingtip feathers. What you see is pretty much a straight edge from the shoulder across the top of the wing, over the edge, down to the base of the body. And so these, as you would expect with falcons, are kind of like the Mercedes-Benz, the Ferraris of the bird world. They're built to have sleek lines, not a lot of edges and things like that. Makes them very smooth, which makes them very fast. And that's, of course, what the family's known for. And so if you don't see a lot of those wing feathers and it's a smaller bird of prey, chances are you're looking at a falcon. Another characteristic of them is they oftentimes will keep their tail nice and skinny, so they don't flare it out like other birds, like a chicken or a turkey would. They keep that tail nice and skinny to keep that sleek line, to keep them fast. Now, conversely, we have something like the accipiters. This might be a group you're not as familiar with if you don't know accipiter. That's referring to 3 birds of prey that we have here in North America: the northern goshawk, the Cooper's hawk, and the sharp-shinned hawk. These are oftentimes birds that you're going to see near your bird feeder if you have one in the backyard, because they like to eat other small birds. So these are blue jay sized to a little bit bigger, normal hawk sized birds. And while they have a narrow tail, like you can see in the image right here, their wings will oftentimes show those little wing feathers individually. So that's the characteristic you could use to tell a falcon from an accipiter, like our Cooper's hawk, you can oftentimes see flying around. Now, other species like the buteos is a word you may not know. That's just referring to kind of the general hawk, like a red-tailed hawk, a Swainson's hawk, or a Phrygianus hawk, those sorts of things. Those are your typical hawks you might see out in the environment. Harrier is another word for, if you're familiar with a marsh hawk. They're found in marshes, grasslands, those sorts of things. And something like an owl over here on the right looks like your hawk, but the difference, of course, is they don't have that long pointy beak, that long pointy face. They're very blunted along the front. And so if you see a bird of prey flying along, they're flat, or it almost looks like they don't have a head, chances are you're looking at an owl flying along. Now, another thing to keep in mind, we talked about time of day to look for our birds of prey. Owls, certainly you can find them at night, but because you typically see them at night does not mean you won't be seeing them flying during the day. I've seen plenty of owls fly around when it's broad daylight out. It just depends on what activity they're doing. And so don't rule it out just yet. If you happen to see one of these birds during the day, it could still be an owl, so look for that head if you get a chance to see it closely enough. All right, moving on to warblers. From the pictures you can see right here, they can be pretty difficult to tell apart. It depends a little bit on the pattern, the colors, those sorts of things. And if you've already tried looking at warblers, you know that they can be the bane of a lot of birders' existence, and that's because they can be really hard to see. Birds like our warblers, our small songbirds, they feed on insects. That's why they have that long, skinny, pointed beak. And so finding them in bushes, in the thick parts of trees where there's lots of leaves, because that's where you would find a lot of the bugs, and that's what they're going for. That's why they're around. And they have a fairly high metabolism because they're such a small bird, which means they're constantly feeding. And so they're constantly moving around looking for a bug that's stuck to the bark or in amongst the leaves, those sorts of things. And that can make it very difficult to see them. So the key with warblers, I always recommend for my guests, is patience. Because chances are, if you keep following that bird with your binoculars, you'll get a moment where you can see the bird in better detail. Sometimes you're just seeing the movement where the leaves move, the twig moves, but you know there's a bird there. Just follow it along. Eventually it'll show its face, it'll show its wing, it'll show its tail, something that you can start to use to identify that bird. And so slow down, look at that bird with your binoculars, and just follow it along, and just wait for that bird to come out. And sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes they fly off to another tree and you don't see where they go. But more than not, if you give them a little bit of time, you'll see something. It may be quick, but you'll see something that'll help you identify. Now, the beauty of a hard bird group like warblers is they've created resources to help birders tackle those. And so this is an excellent field guide. This is done by Tom Stevenson and Scott Whittle, and they spent years taking pictures of every single warbler you could find in North America. And not just one picture, but pictures of different angles, different ages, if it's a male, it's a female, if it's a young one, it's an old one, because there's variations in between each of those different categories of warblers. And they put all those in the book. And so you can kind of consider it the Bible of warbler birding in the birding community. And so I strongly recommend, if you want to tackle this birding group, to buy that book. If you don't want to buy the book, because it's quite a big book, it's heavier, it's actually even bigger than the guide, and it's just talking about warblers, you can get the app. They also have an app version, which works wonderfully well. And this app, I'm going to show you some pictures of it right here. It's a really great app. What it does is it shows the different features of those birds. So you can get the full body view, which is like what I see in the middle right here. You can get just the head. You can get it at 45-degree angle. You can get it from completely underside, because remember, these birds are found in the trees. So oftentimes you don't see the head, you just see the bottom part of the bird, or you can just see just the tail. And they contend, and rightly so, the authors do, that you can identify any warbler in the United States, in Canada, by just looking at the butt of the bird. And so that's why they put this view in the app. You can take a 3D view of the bird and look at just the butt and be able to identify that that is an American redstart. And the reason for that is you look at some of the colors and patterns. Because key with warbler identification is not necessarily to look at the entire bird, but being able to take a snapshot of just a section of the bird, and oftentimes you'll be able to identify it. So in the case of our male, adult male American redstart here, they've got a white belly and vent. They've got a couple spots right here towards the base of the tail is a bit darker. You'll notice that there's orange on the tail. There's black tips to the tail. And then you'll notice there's kind of like two lobes, so two pieces of the tail sticking out. So it's not one straight line like we saw on the falcons or our accipiters, but it's got a couple feathers sticking out going different directions. And so those factors, if you're able to note that or take a picture of that, you can use just that information to be able to identify that bird. And that's the same case for just about every species you could find in North America. And that's where this app is pretty useful, is by using those little pieces, because almost never do you get to see the full beauty of a bird unless it's a nice male singing out in the open. Oftentimes they're skulking in the, making it very difficult to get a full picture of that bird. But if you can get little pieces of it, that's the key to warbler identification. Now, moving on to our next little category, shorebirds. This is another difficult group because a lot of these birds are relatively small. They're brown, they move around a lot. They sometimes are very flighty, so it's difficult to get close to get a good look. And so I'm gonna give you some features to help identify this group. And this is a fairly broad group. We can have things like whimbrels and godwits and plovers and sandpipers and turnstones, yellowlegs, all of these groups of birds all put together as the shorebirds. And the reason for that is because their name kind of lists it. They're found typically around the shore. Now that can be the shore of the ocean, like across the Atlantic or the Pacific in a beachy, muddy, flat, something like that. But they also can be found in plenty of freshwater environments. You can find a lot of species a little bit closer to home if you live a little bit more interior and found around near a lake or even along a river, a pond. Typically, they're going to be around water. It's not always the case. You can find a killdeer in a parking lot in the middle of a state park in Texas. I've done that. But this is typically what you're going to find. And because they're typically found in this environment, they're going to be shaped very similarly. So I'm going to tell you how to look at a shorebird and understanding what pieces to note as different. Because for the most part, in the case of this Dunlin right here, they're going to have a pretty basic shape. Every shorebird is going to have a relatively small head, kind of a round, chunky body, tapers down to a tail. But what you want to notice is looking at the beak. Is it longer? Is it shorter? Is it curved down, curved up, curved a lot, curved very little? What color is the beak? And the same can be said for the legs. So the legs a little bit longer, a little bit shorter. Now the color of legs is also pretty useful, but one key characteristic of the color of the legs is that the color of the legs can depend a little bit on where they are. Oftentimes you'll find these birds in muddy flats. So as the tide recedes out, rather than the sandy bottom, you might have a very muddy bottom to that estuary, that lake, what have you. And so they could be moving around in that mud. And so you may see a brown leg, but that's because the leg is muddy, not because it's actually brown. So that's one thing to take note of when you're looking at these birds. Another thing in the case of this killdeer right here is to note specific patterns that look very bold or different. So in the case of a killdeer and a lot of plovers, they have black stripes, and the number of black stripes, where those black stripes are, or in the case of some of our other sandpipers, whether the brown goes from the neck all the way down to the belly or stops midway or turns buffy or spotted, those are characteristics you want to note on a shorebird because that's going to differentiate species from each other. Here's a good example of kind of a difficulty when it comes to shorebirds. Is shorebirds oftentimes like to be in large groups, and they like to be in what we call mixed species flocks, meaning that it's a lot of different individuals of different species hanging out together. Now, for me, as more of an experienced birder, I love these kinds of flocks because I can sit for 10 minutes looking at these, trying to pick out all the different individual species that I find. It's like very much a Where's Waldo when you don't really know how many Waldos are in the picture. So it can kind of make it kind of fun, but it can be very daunting, especially for a newer birder. And so I picked this particular picture, found this online, because it shows two different species that look a little bit different from each other. And when you're looking at shorebirds, in addition to the different factors I was talking about, you can also use size as a pretty interesting characteristic to be able to identify it. You can use this for a lot of different birds as well. Say, look at this picture. The very obvious bird that stands out, of course, is the nice kind of golden tan bird. Now, if we look at this golden tan bird, it's got a fairly long beak, or really long beak to be honest, and it's two-toned. It's black at the tip and it's pink towards the base. Now that makes this a pretty interesting bird. This might stand out in the field guide. So I'm going to flip through my field guide, try to identify this bird, and I'm going to come up with the fact that this is probably, let's see if it pops up, a marbled godwit. Look at the non-breeding image right here. You can see it's buffy, which is that kind of buffy golden brown. It's got a pink base to its beak, a black bill tip. Okay, so I'm almost positive this is a marbled godwit. Now the other bird, which looks like mostly all I'm seeing is another one species, because a lot of the individuals look pretty much identical to each other. But I'm seeing another bird, but it's a similar size, but maybe a bit smaller. And so I can use size in this case, because now I've identified the godwit. I look at how big it is, and I see that the length is 18 inches, which is a big shorebird actually. A lot of them are a lot smaller, more like robin sized and sparrow sized. So I know this is a big shorebird, and it's pretty close in size to the marbled godwit. So I can flip through my field guide, looking at all the different birds and looking for a bird that lists around the same size. And I came across this one, the willet. Hey, it's kind of gray like the bird I'm looking at. And looking at the size, it's 15 inches. So it's just a few inches smaller than the bird I know for sure is a godwit. And so that helps me identify that. And we can use that in the same case for smaller birds. So if you know what your common shorebird is in your area, and you see another one walk by and say, okay, that one's a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller than the one I know for sure, start looking through the field guide, see one that may be a ½ an inch or another inch smaller or bigger, depending on what you're looking at. And that helps you identify a lot of different types of shorebirds that way. So using size is pretty important. Now I will say, and the reason why we use this kind of already identified bird is size can be a tricky thing to judge by itself. So if I just see one shorebird, trying to identify it by size can be hard, because if you're looking through your binoculars, you're different distances away, the lighting's different, a bird can appear larger or smaller based on a little bit of optical illusion. And so you don't want to necessarily just look at one bird and say, okay, that bird is 5 inches, I can tell from 200 yards away. But if I know the species it's sitting right next to, I can look at the size of that species and be able to say that one's definitely smaller or larger and be able to identify it that way. So keep that size in mind when looking at shorebirds. All right, our last kind of hard group is sparrows. Now, sparrows are a fantastic group to learn, because there's a lot of different types of individuals that, depending on where you're at, they can be seen a little bit easier or harder. So they're a good challenge group. And again, like I've been saying, the best thing to do when it comes to these harder groups is go out into the field, get practice with them, and get used to the different species you should be seeing in your area. And so most sparrow species are field species. This is a field out in Iowa, and getting a chance to look out into the field and see the different species and get to know the differences is pretty important to do that. Not all sparrow species are found just in grasslands, but that's usually where you can see the biggest diversity, which helps that much more with your practice. Now, take this species right here. This is a brewer sparrow, and it's a fairly drab bird. You notice a little bit of striping and that sort of thing, but it's overall not a very obvious bird to note, like, what part of this bird should I be paying attention to. So typically with sparrows, what you really want to notice are the head and the belly. Those are the two things. Any sparrow species, if I just see the head, I can probably identify it, but if I see the belly too, I definitely can identify it. The back of most sparrows looks fairly similar. It's going to have some striping to it, some kind of buffy orange coloration, that sort of thing. Those can be helpful depending on the species. But if you can just look at the head and the belly, you're going to nail every species if you have the time to look at them. And to really drive this point home, this is some images from the Delaware Nature Society. They were doing some bird banding, putting little metal bands around the legs of these birds to be able to track them as they move from place to place. And they took a picture of the birds while they were in their hands and took a picture of just the heads of these different sparrows. You can see there's a good bit of diversity between the different sparrows we can find in North America here. And I want to point out the things you want to look for in a sparrow head to be able to identify them apart. And so for some species, you may see, like take this one right here, the American tree sparrow, you can see there's an eye stripe, meaning that there's a stripe going through the eye, but it doesn't continue on towards the front of the bill. But if you look at this chipping sparrow down here in the middle, you can see a black eye stripe going all the way through to the bill. Noting how far that eye stripe goes is pretty important. There's also the eyebrow stripe. You can take a look at these birds, nice eyebrow stripe here or down below, or again on the chipping sparrow. And the birding term for this, birding jargon, this is also called the supercilium. You may see that listed in your field guide as a supercilium, but I will say a lot of field guides are moving away from some of the more technical jargon because everyone pretty much knows what an eyebrow stripe, where to look for that on a bird. So keep an eye out for whether it has an eyebrow stripe and what color that is. Say, take our Savannah sparrow right here, has an eyebrow stripe, but it's typically a little bit yellow towards the front, and that's a good characteristic for a Savannah sparrow. You also might note the color of the beak, whether they've got a solid all black beak, or if it's solid all brown, or if there's a dark top to it or a dark tip to it. Those are other characteristics to note. And even what they call an eye ring, because there's little feathers, you can see it on this sparrow right here, little feathers around the edge of the eye, almost like eyelashes, and it helps protect the eye. Some birds have the same color as the rest of their head, and other birds, like our field sparrow right here on the right, has a bit more of whitish feathers around the eye there. And so that eye ring is another thing to note. And not only that, but is that eye ring complete full circle? Or is it broken where it's like it has eyeshadow on the top and eyeshadow underneath, but nothing along the sides? That's another thing to keep an eye out for. Noting those little characteristics of the face then allows you to go again back to the field guide and be able to identify it. Now to take that a step further, they took a picture of the bellies of these birds, and there's kind of two categories of sparrows in this case. There are sparrows with streaks or spots on their belly, or there's sparrows that have a nice clean belly. Maybe it's clean brown or clean gray, clean white. Note those characteristics as well. And between the head and the belly, you'll be able to identify the bird when you're looking in your field guide. Take, for example, our dark-eyed junco here on the upper right side. It has a fairly clean head. There's really nothing as far as striping or what have you on the head, so that's not going to be helpful. But if you look at the belly too, has that gray continues on to the belly, and then in the middle, it splits into a nice clean white belly. So that's a pretty interesting characteristic to note, compared to some of our other sparrows that have a lot of spots, like this fox sparrow right here. All right, so that helps you a little bit with the different hard bird groups, just to get you started and really what to notice when you look at one of these groups to be able to identify it in the book. We're going to move now on to the bird's sounds and how to listen to the sound of a bird, and then what to study and how to study in order to get to know the birds in your area. So to start off with, it helps to know how to describe that song, that call in actual words. And so I'm going to kind of whistle here a little bit to get you an idea of what each of these sound like, but you have different kind of categories of pitch patterns. So there's monotone, then there's the up slur, or the down slur, or more of an over slur where it starts low and gets high in the middle and down towards the back, like or an under slur, which is the opposite of something like that. Those kinds of things you want to be able to note in a bird's song or call, because that's going to be a key characteristic when you're looking in your field guide. Another thing is the type of song that we see. We've got something like a phrase where you can count the individual notes, but it's fairly short. So it's you could probably count all those notes if you're listening. Now, a series is like a phrase. It's fairly short, easy to count the notes, but they're repeated. So it's more like that's a series. A warble is probably the most complex song you're going to find. It's very difficult to count the notes. It goes all over the place. So it can, that's a warble. Very difficult to note the actual different notes of the song and maybe even kind of which direction those notes are going. Whereas a trill is another common bird call. This is like a series, but it's difficult to count the notes. It's a lot of repeated notes just like each other, but can't really identify each individual note. Now, another thing to keep in mind is not just the noises that you're hearing, but the silences in between. Those pauses are also super important. For some species, they may sing, then pause, sing, then pause. So just a little bit of a pause there. Or they can be completely consecutive in their long set of notes and song. There's no pause the entire time. It doesn't even sound like taking a breath. Depending on the species, that is a key characteristic. Something like the Pacific wren we find out in the Western North America has a long song that can last 30 seconds or more, and you never hear a stop. And that's a good way to note that species versus some of the other closely related species in that area. So keep an eye on not just the noise, but the spaces in between the noises as well. Now we can also use mnemonics, which means putting a word or phrase to the song to help to learn it. So take the picture that I've got up in the upper left there. That is a black-capped chickadee. And they're what we call a namesayer, meaning that their name came from their song. And so I'm going to play the black-capped chickadee here so you can listen to this. And you can maybe hear the chickadee-dee-dee-dee-dee in their song. Chickadee-dee-dee-dee. So that helps to be able to learn that species. Now, a different example in the bottom left there, we have the red-winged blackbird. That one isn't a namesayer, of course, and their phrase doesn't actually equate to an actual word. Their mnemonic we oftentimes use in the birding community is conqueree. So listen to that. So you can use conqueree, or maybe you hear something a little bit different. All it needs to do for a mnemonic is work for you. And when you look at a field guide and you look at this section on that bird, the voice often uses some sort of mnemonic. Sometimes it's an actual word, or sometimes it's like a zeet or a zer that sounds like the bird when they're calling. Another couple of cool examples we have here is a barred owl. Their mnemonic is, "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" So listen to that. So do you hear that? Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all? So that's a good one to listen for out in the forest. Another one that, depending on where you are in the world, may sound a little bit different is the Carolina wren. And for some people, that sounds like tea kettle, tea kettle, tea kettle, tea kettle. So listen to it again. So there you go. So depending on the species, you can sometimes use these mnemonics to be able to identify them apart from each other. So of course, when it comes to learning bird songs, start with an app like Merlin or eBird or something like that. Get to know the species that are found in your area, and you can flip through and listen to those calls. So those are the most common birds you're going to hear on the trail or wherever you may be going. Now there's another cool feature here, which is called BirdNet. This is a couple apps. BirdNet is for Google Play or Android. Song Sleuth is for Apple. These are actual apps that you can put up to the bird song that your phone will listen and try to identify it, which is a pretty incredible piece of technology. It's almost like Shazam for bird song, which is really cool. The key with these ones though is you need a fairly quiet environment, so you can't have a lot of human noise, you can't be talking, those sorts of things, and you can't have a lot of other birds calling. So if you have just one bird calling in your quiet backyard, it does a pretty good job, especially with the more common species. So I encourage you to try to download one of these apps, use it. Don't take it as definitely right, but it uses it as a way to basically get you really close to the actual bird. Maybe it is the actual bird, or maybe it sounds very close to it, and then gets you in that ballpark to be able to actually identify that. So those are some really powerful apps, and of course, as people use them, they're going to keep getting better and better. Now, another thing I use is something called Larkwire. This is a website, but it's also an app, and it's a quiz app for song. You can put in a region or location or types of birds you want to learn, and it will quiz you on those different species, which is pretty awesome. I use Larkwire every single year to help refresh my memory with the warbler songs, which can be very different from each other. And you can put in individuals, you can customize it for the species that you have the toughest time listening to and remembering, or you can put it in for a region or a type of habitat, and it'll cycle through the birds you should be hearing in the area and quiz you on the different types of calls and songs you might hear, which is a pretty powerful app. A lot of people don't know about this one, but this is a great way to learn bird song. Now, this feature right here on the right shows it'll ask you if you get it right or wrong, and then you'll be able to say I got it right or I got it wrong. So not even just quiz you on species that you see, but just say, hey, I'm in the forest in Eastern North America, or in this case Western North America, with the black-headed grosbeak, and see if you get it right. So it's a pretty cool app. I encourage you to download it and use it. Now also, if you want to use a CD, this is how I learned as a birder. I put a CD in the car and went through the various bird songs. Depending on which region you're in, there will be different CDs. This is for Eastern Central. Peterson Field Guides does a great job with song. So there's also one for Western North America. And the narrator goes through the songs, talks about some of the tips to tell them apart, and then plays them while you're driving or listening at home. So I highly recommend this as well. Now recently, in the last few years, some books came out by an author by Nathan Pipelow, and he did the field guide to the bird sounds of the different parts of North America. And I actually got a chance to meet Nathan when I was doing a Christmas bird count in Colorado. Fantastic guy and very knowledgeable when it comes to bird sounds. And so he did a great job with his field guide. He puts through what we call sonograms or spectrograms, which is a visual representation of those songs. And so you can use that to help identify and learn some of the songs and calls of the birds in your area. Fantastic job. Some of the information that I was talking about with the phrases and the series and the warbles comes directly from his information. Now, in addition to the book, there is a website component to this book that's available for everyone. You don't have to have the book, but at the URL down below, you can type that in and be able to pull up a whole companion library of the songs that he talks about, as well as others. And if you click on this button right here down below that says how to visualize sounds, it goes into even more depth on what's called earbirding.com. This is a blog done by Nathan and others, where they really talk about the really intricacies of learning bird songs in different places and types of songs. So some of that I talked about came directly from this site here. So I encourage you, if you really want to get into bird song, this is really a great place to check out some more information. In addition, there is something called Maculae Library. This is an online database of a bunch of pictures, but also a bunch of sounds of various birds. And so if you're in a region of the world where there isn't a lot of resources, you don't have a CD, you don't have a book that talks about the bird songs in your area, you can use Maculae Library, and people from around the world have uploaded songs they've recorded, uploaded pictures they've taken, and you can use this website as your own way of studying the birds in your area and what kind of sounds and songs you should be hearing. So it's a great website, maculaelibrary.com. Now finally, how to be a better birder. Now this refers to, again, the ethics of being a good birder, the stewardship that you want to start thinking about, those sorts of things. We're going to start off talking a little about the American Bird Association. So this is an organization in the United States, in Canada, and in parts of Mexico, where it's not only a community of birders, but they put out magazine, podcast, a great website, and a lot of resources for birders. So I encourage you to check out this organization. You can become a member of it if you want. But they put out what's called the Birding Ethics, the American Birding Association Ethics. And this is a list of things that they kind of say is the manifesto of birding, what makes a good birder out there in the environment. We're going to talk about the different features. The first one is respect and promote birds and their environment. So as you can imagine, while you're out there birding in these beautiful landscapes, it's a good idea to give back. Those birds are giving you a lot in terms of enjoyment. So you want to be able to give back to those birds. So they be thinking about participating in conservation, or at least protecting the natural spaces that you're in. Stay on trail, don't break any bushes, wreck any habitat as you're driving around. Those are things you want to be thinking about when it comes to protecting the birds and respecting them. In addition, you want to think about your pets. I gotta say, the picture on the right of the dog, I found that picture online and I had to put it in. It's pretty funny. they've done lots of studies on nesting birds and birds in places like beaches and in forests. And if a bird or a dog is let loose wandering around, it's seen as a predator and can stress them out. In some cases, they may even abandon the whole nest that they're trying to raise those chicks in. So if you have a dog with you, make sure to keep that dog leashed up close to you, and it's a lot less stressful for the bird. On the left, cats also are a bit of an issue with birds because if they're outdoor cats wandering around in your backyard or a feral cat in your neighborhood, they do eat some small birds like songbirds, and those are birds you're trying to see. And so keeping a cat inside, or if you want to give them that outdoor time, which can be pretty important to them, you can build something right here, which is called a catio, an outdoor cat patio. Little outdoor enclosure for your cat to wander in, get that fresh air, be out there in the sights and smells, but staying away from your bird feeder and not eating those beautiful birds that you're trying to see. So keep that in mind. Now, another thing to think about is window collisions. If you have big bay windows at your house, you might get birds running into them. And there's a lot of different ways to solve this. A lot of people use like bird silhouettes of hawks or stickers or things like that. Those can kind of work, but not often very well. And so one way that I recommend, this is actually at Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge in Eastern Virginia. I used to work in that area. And they put these long pieces of paracord, which is military nylon cord, or you can use string, something like that, and just draped it from the top of the window, didn't tie it off at the bottom. And that was enough to keep those birds away. They have almost no window strikes now that they put that up. And so you can find information about that online, and that helped solve some of the strikes that may be hitting if you put that feeder too close to the window. Now also, if you're a photographer getting into birding, or a birder that's getting into the photography of what you're seeing, you always want to be very respectful of the birds that you're viewing and keep your distance. Use a zoom lens, don't try to get too close. In the case of the sandhill crane right here, you might notice at the bottom right there, it's got a little baby chick. You really want to make sure that you don't scare that adult off and abandons that chick. And the same can be said for more sensitive species like owls. While it's awesome to see these birds out in the landscape and in a nest, in this case, this adult owl with its couple of chicks, if you get too close, you could spook that owl and it may never come back to raise those chicks. So be very respectful of the birds you're viewing, and especially if they're in a sensitive time of year like nesting or mating, something like that. Now, another thing is what's called playback. And so you may know if you're you can play a bird song, and that bird may hear it because they're a bit territorial. They may come over to investigate or even call back to it. It can be a very useful tool when identifying birds or trying to attract birds to an area. But you want to use callback as judiciously as possible. Use it as little as possible, because you can stress out that bird a lot, particularly if you're in the right area. When I use callback, which isn't very often, I almost always think about the location I'm in. I'm in an area where a lot of other birders are probably going to be, something like a state park, something like a national park or a refuge, and they may also be using callback. So that same individual may be getting called 1, 2, 3 times a day and staying off of its territory, getting stressed out, and maybe not being able to survive that mating season. So the only times I really use callback are in places like my own backyard, or a place where I know there really aren't any birders around, and I only use it on species that aren't sensitive to it or aren't very rare. And so that case, I'm not stressing out that population too much if I use callback from time to time. So be very careful how you use it as you're birding. So keep that in mind, especially with things like owls. Now, next, respect and promote the birding community and its individual members. So this is important in a few different ways. You want to give back to their birding community by being able to report your sightings. eBird is a great way to do that. This is a national database, international database, where researchers and scientists can look at the birds that you're seeing when you submit a list, be able to use that information for their own research. So it's giving back to the scientific community, giving back to birding conservation. But in addition, other birders could see your list and be able to see what you're seeing in an area. I've used this a lot to be able to, when I move to a new spot, when I drive through a new area, I can look at the lists that are in that area and see new birds that I want to see, or see what to expect, and use that information to be able to bird a little more efficiently, a little more effectively when I'm in an area. So do your part to give back to the birding community and submit your lists as you get better at birding and get better at identifying birds. In addition, be respectful of non-birders. I myself have come across a couple weddings out in the woods or in a field somewhere, and with a pair of binoculars can be very obnoxious, if not downright disruptive. So keep in mind all their people around and what they're doing. This can be said for knowing where your binoculars are looking. I've had several instances where the bird is standing right behind somebody, but I don't flip my binoculars up and then stare at that person because that's very unnerving. But in addition, I've been in places like, say, Miami in Florida, where there's a lot of introduced parrots and macaws in the city of Miami. You can drive through some of the neighborhoods and find some of them, but you want to make sure you're not pointing your binoculars at somebody's house, because obviously that's an invasion of privacy, and you don't want to come off as the creepy birder. And so keep that in mind. Keep in mind other people and their other activities while you're out birding. In addition, as you get better at birding, you want to be able to promote birding for other folks. And so help younger birders, help newer birders. Especially, we want to create a community of birders that is very diverse in different cultural backgrounds, ethnicities. All of this is really important because the more diverse group we have of birders, the better the areas are going to be conserved, because they're going to get interested in the birds, they're going to get interested in the natural landscapes, and get interested in making sure to conserve them. And that just makes our hobby of birding that much more successful and important in our national landscape. So keep that in mind, promote new birders, and be respectful of those folks that are out birding in different ways and of different backgrounds, because everybody can enjoy birds in different ways, and certainly can really become a very important part of our birding community. And finally, respect and promote the laws and rights of others. This is especially important. Make sure you're never going on somebody's private road, private property, never cross fences. Some rare birds can be found in the most random of places. There have been plenty of instances of like snowy owls in the eastern United States hanging out in somebody's backyard, their farm field, or even on top of their house. And depending on the individual, this can be welcome. They welcome the birders along and get a chance to meet new birders and get really excited about this interesting bird in their backyard. Or some people just don't want that. They don't want other people around, and be respectful of that, because you want to put yourself out as a very good member of the birding community and respectful of people's property. And in addition, when you're out in a new location, a new town, a new hotel, you're wearing your binoculars, be a good steward and good representative of the birding community. Talk about the cool things you're seeing, and be very nice and respectful, because if you get interested in the birds and in the birders, that's just going to make our hobby that much better. So keep those things in mind. And finally, this lovely quote I've got right here is unknown, but it's a really interesting quote. A novice has made dozens of misidentifications. An expert has made thousands. Always remember, not every bird is identifiable. Even for the people that wrote the field guides, they can't identify every bird they see. Some cases that birding sighting is very fleeting, very quick. The lighting's bad, it's a hybrid, or various other factors that can go along. And so note that because you can't identify every bird you saw does not make you a bad birder, just makes you a learning birder, which every single birder is a learning birder. And in addition, even if you misidentify it wrong, it's okay. Learn from those mistakes and be open to people saying, hey, actually, I think it's this and here's why. Maybe they're right, maybe you're right, but all you got to do is look at the field guide, look at maps, and get that evidence to figure out exactly what you're looking for. So keep that in mind. So finally, I just want to leave you with this beautiful picture. This is by the artist of Charlie Harper. He does a fantastic job of graphic images of birds. This is actually a nighttime migration is what this one is depicting. And so remember that birds are beautiful creatures. It's an interesting environment to be able to get out there, get a chance to see these birds in their habitat, and really slow down, listen for them, look for those key characteristics, and you'll get to be that much better of a birder. So with that in mind, thank you so much for tuning in for this presentation, and I look forward to hearing for some questions.
Thank you, Mike. That was great. We do have some great questions for you, and we are at the top of the hour. So for those of you watching who have to leave us, just know I will have the recording available on our website around this time tomorrow. If you have a question for Mike, you can submit that in your control panel in the questions field. Okay. Could you remind us the name of the app you mentioned when we were talking about warblers?
Yes, it's called the Warbler app. All you have to type into your iTunes or what have you is Warbler, and it'll pop right up.
Great. And are there field guides that can identify a bird based on the nest it makes, if that's all you can find?
Yeah, actually, Peterson Field Guides, and I think maybe Audubon as well. They put out field guides that refer to just the nest, or there's a section especially on the nest in the field guide. If you go to any book website or bookstore, you might be able to find those different guides. And there's even resources online as well.
Great. Someone just wrote in asking if you can identify the bird for us that's on this thank you slide.
Oh yeah, this is a common wren. This picture was actually taken in Yellowstone National Park a couple winters ago. If you look closely in the eye, you can probably see me and a snowy parking lot.
Great. And speaking of that, someone wants to know where you guide trips for NatHab.
Yeah. So I got in a few different places. I guide in Yellowstone National Park and Grand Teton National Park. I also guide in Alaska. I guide up in northern Manitoba in Churchill for our polar bear trips, and I also guide in Greenland.
Great. Okay, back to birding questions. Someone wants some tips on how to, let me see here, how to identify fly catchers better, because they seem to have a lot of trouble even with photographs.
Yeah. So flycatchers, or also will be known as tyrant flycatchers or pidnax flycatchers, which is the genus, is a very difficult group of flycatchers. That's again where noting what's common in your area is going to be super helpful. That narrows it down quite a bit. So don't just use a field guide, which will say what flycatchers are in your state, but using an app which can put it a little bit shorter down to your specific location will help narrow it down to a few flycatchers. Then from there, you need to look a little bit at the information that those apps and those field guides list, because depending on the species, it may be something like can only be identified if you hear the call note. And so there are plenty of very experienced birders, including myself, where if it's one of those species, I don't hear it sing, I don't identify. I list it down on my list as a flycatcher, and that's it. And so noting, listening for those songs, so being patient, looking for specific behaviors. Some flycatchers will take their tail and just flick it every so often. Phoebes are pretty common for that. So looking for behavior. And then noting color differences, and the length of the bill, the shape of the bill are also pretty key characteristics. I will say flycatchers are a very difficult group, and it's hard to put one silver bullet on what will help you identify a flycatcher. It really depends on your area, and so studying your field guide, noting those differences, and then looking for help from other birders. Something I didn't mention is if you can go on a birding walk, certainly social distance this time of the year, but if you're able to go on a birding walk with a more experienced birder, someone who's a bit more used to the flycatchers in your area, or even joining an online community of a listserv or a Facebook group that can help you with some of those identifications, is going to be pretty helpful.
Great. At what age do the red-tailed hawk tail feathers turn from brown to red?
So it's usually within their first year they're changing over. So, but that can last quite a while. Some bird species, they look like their parents like a month after they're hatched, but red-tailed hawks can keep that tail for up to a year. You can see it from time to time. I typically see the brick red tail, but the brick red tail isn't the only thing you need to look for.
Okay. Someone had a conversation with their neighbor, it looks like. They had a great horned owl, I guess, one behind their house, and their neighbor claimed to have seen the adult moving one of the chicks, and that sounded odd to this person who's watching. Have you ever heard of great horned owls moving chicks from the nest?
No, that's I wouldn't expect that. Some mammal species certainly do. I've seen squirrels do that, but for birds, it's a little more difficult to do that because they don't have the same types of maneuverability with their beak and their talons. It would be quite difficult to do that. What they might have actually seen is a great horned owl bringing a dead bird to feed to their chicks into the nest or moving it out of the nest. great horned owls eat a lot of mammals. They're actually known as a skunk specialist. They have a terrible sense of smell, so eating skunks perfectly fine for them. But they'll eat other birds as well, small birds, terns. They'll eat terns and things like that. So they might have been seeing them bring a bird or take a dead bird out of the nest that had been finished picking at. So that would be probably more likely.
Okay, interesting. Going back to the windows with the paracord, did you say you do not have to attach the bottom of the cord, or should you?
Yeah, so to talk a little bit more about how this works, you take pieces of string or paracord, and what works really easy is if you can get a little piece of molding, like a long piece of molding or a piece of wood or a little bit of plastic, you drill a hole every 2 inches or 1.5 inches, and you feed that line through. You tie it out of the top, so it's attached to that little molding section, but the bottom is let loose. It waves around in the wind, which is actually important because if it moves, then it's harder for the bird to see that, oh, I can like fly and fit myself through that 2-inch opening and then continue on, and in this case through the window. And so if you just attach the top, then you can even use something like 3M strips, and then you can it's super easy to remove. And then on top of that, some people, they don't want that obstructing their view for the entire year. So think about when you're getting those bird strikes. Is it during spring migration, during fall migration? And you can put it up just for those 1 or 2 months, protect those birds that are moving through, and then you can take it down for the rest of the year when you really don't get that many bird strikes. And that is, by and large, the most foolproof way to stop bird strikes. The stickers or drawing with soap on your windows, that kind of stuff can work, but not nearly the same effectiveness as those strings every 1.5 to 2 inches across the entire window.
Okay. And on that subject, if someone finds a dead bird in their backyard, in this instance, someone found a dead woodpecker in their back door, is there a proper way of disposing of it, and should it be reported to any specific birding groups, or is that even necessary?
Oh, that's a good question. So if you're a bit more of an experienced birder and you're able to identify the bird, it may be useful to report it to your local birding group if it's something that's unusual. So if you look at your field guide, you look at your app, and it's listed as rare, that is certainly a very useful information to pass on to the scientific community, be it some of your birding friends, birding group, or there's even some places on some birding websites where you can list that. There's one called, I believe it's called D-Bird, so D as in dead, D-Bird, where you can list that. But birds die all the time for various reasons, and so it's not necessarily something to be alarmed about. The easiest thing with a dead bird is pick it up with a glove or a shovel and then just put it in the woods somewhere, because that body is now useful to other animals. It's useful to the insects or to a scavenger like a coyote, raccoon, fox, something like that will eat that carcass. And so don't worry too much about disposing it. Maybe just get it out of your yard by putting it in the woods or the fence, along the fence line, something like that is pretty important. Now, if you notice a lot of dead birds in your backyard, and that could be something to think about either with window strikes or something to report, because there's certainly been examples of a lot of birds catching a particular disease, and that kind of data is quite useful. So if you notice a lot of birds or a very rare bird, that's the time when I would report it.
Great. And someone just downloaded the Merlin app. What packs do you recommend them loading?
Oh, so that's all depending on where you're at. So they have packs for major in the world. It's a pretty powerful app these days. But you really just want to download the one for your area just to start with. Now, if you start traveling, that's when you start thinking about, oh, I'm going to go to Australia in a couple of years. I'll make sure to download the Australia section. But just downloading for your area is all you need to start with, for sure.
Okay, great. And the person who asked earlier about what trips you do, they're going to Yellowstone in September, and they're wondering if you're going to be their guide.
Ooh, maybe. I don't know which trips are running, but I will tell you that I'm running a trip early September.
Okay, great. Let's see, is there a national website that lets people know about, it says such things, I'm assuming it's about the dead birds, if there's viruses or diseases or something?
So typically, there isn't a website built specifically for bird diseases that I know of, at least. But tuning in to your local either Department of Natural Resources or U.S. Fisheries and Wildlife, those sorts of things are the websites that will have information on health of wild populations. And so those kinds of places are the places to look for that information. Because depending on the species of bird or groups of birds, they'll list conservation issues or species they're particularly focused on because they're endangered or diseases like you're mentioning.
Okay. And last question we'll take for today is, if you see a bird that's been banded, who do you report it to?
Oh, yeah. There's a couple things you want to do. If you can get a picture, that's fantastic. The picture is really what they want. But if you are able to see it close enough to note the number on the band or the colors that you're seeing and which leg they're on, that's also used for information. Report birdband.gov. If you just type that into Google, or I forget if it's report birdband or reportband.gov. But that website, you can report it, and then that will then send it off to various birding folks that are doing the bird banding. And then oftentimes they can get back with you or with a certificate listing when that bird was banded and where it was banded and how long ago. And that's how we found some bird species can be years old and found in different parts of the world even, is based off of those bird bands. So that's another important site to check out as well if you happen to see a bird band. Sometimes it's very close to home. A lot of things like geese and gulls will be found pretty close to home. They were banded last week or in the same area last year, but you'll occasionally get some interesting birds. Now, that is something to note. If you find a dead bird with a band, that is something you can also report on that website as well.
Good to know. Thank you. That was super interesting, yeah. Mike. I'm going to turn things back over to you for some closing comments.
Of course. So folks, thanks so much with tuning into this birding program. I hope you learned a little bit more, taking your birding to that next level and getting a chance to get a little more excited about some of the more hard to identify birds out in your backyard. So hopefully I'll be able to do another birding presentation in the future, and I wish you luck out there birding and seeing whatever you can see. So thanks so much for tuning in.
Thanks, Mike. That was another fun one. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have that replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.